Hello everyone and Assalamu alaikum. This is Introduction to Psychology Part 2 by Dear Knowledge. Okay, starting with the chapter 3, learning, in which we have covered lots of topic. If I give you a quick recap on what we have covered so far and a chapter overview on what we will be learning in this chapter. So let's start with a quick recap and a chapter overview. Here you can see on the screen right in front of you, this is a chapter overview. All the topics mentioned here are those topics which we will be covering in the chapter of learning. Okay, so if I give you a quick recap, so in the past videos we have covered definition of learning, and again it was not just a definition of learning, it was a very detailed lecture. We not only discussed what actually is learning, we not only discussed the definition of learning. Our lecture was not limited to the definition of learning only. We have started with a proper case study, a short case study, and then with the reference of that case study, we also learn about the definition of learning. I've shared the definition of learning with you all in that video. And taking that definition of learning and the case study, we discussed how the learning is associated with that case study. So taking the reference of that case study, we continue the lecture. We discussed every single part, every single term which was used in the definition of learning. Then as we all know that learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior that is brought about experience. So we learned that what does relatively permanent change means. Why did they use the word relatively permanent change, and what does it have to do with the experience? So we learned that, and with the help of the case study, it was very easy for you and for us all of my viewers to understand the definition of learning very clearly. So this was not just a itsy bitsy tiny lecture. If you want to start start your lecture, start learning about the chapter of learning, I would suggest start with the definition of learning. This will help a lot in clearing your concept. And this is what I want. This is the main aim of my YouTube channel, to clear your concept. And then in the next lectures, we started with the types of learning. And as we all know, there are two types of learning: the classical conditioning and the operant conditioning. So we have completed the classical conditioning, which was again a detailed lecture. So that's why I divided the classical conditioning into different parts, like lesson 2 part 1a, lesson 2 part 1b, lesson 2 part 1c, and so on. So every single part was based on a separate detailed lecture on a separate topic that was associated with the classical conditioning. Like, we started with what actually is classical conditioning and who discovered classical conditioning. And obviously we all know it was Ivan Pavlov who discovered the classical conditioning. And how did he discover the classical conditioning? Because he was a physiologist, and we studied the classical conditioning in psychology. So what does the physiology have to do with the psychology? But he accidentally discovered the classical conditioning. He was doing experiment with his dogs. So in the first lecture of the classical conditioning, we learn about the experiment of the Ivan Pavlov and his dog, and how did he discover classical conditioning. And I've also shared a definition of classical conditioning with you all. We also learn about the elements of classical conditioning. What are the elements of classical conditioning? We have learned about that. And stimulus discrimination, stimulus generalization, extinction, spontaneous recovery, biological preparedness, taste aversion, and conditioned emotional response, and many more. There were lots of topics under the topic of classical conditioning. This is just not only a classical conditioning, like the definition of classical conditioning, von Pavlov, and so on. No, the classical conditioning itself is a very detailed. So that's why I have uploaded a very detailed lecture on classical conditioning on my YouTube channel. So if you have missed that lecture, so you can visit the playlist section of my YouTube channel. I have shared all the links, all the previous lectures with you all, and I've also shared the links of all the previous lectures in the description section. And you can also visit my website dearknowledge.com, and you can click on watch online, where you will get all the links in a proper sequence. And you can also check the description section of this video, where you will get the link to all the previous lectures. You can also visit the playlist section, because I have compiled all the previous lectures in a proper sequence according to the topic, according to the chapter, for your ease. So if you want to, if you're still facing any problem, you can ask me in the comment section, and I'll be happy to help you out. Okay, so in this video, we have basically, after the classical conditioning, we have started the operant conditioning. And this lecture, this series of lectures is all about operant conditioning now. So we have learned a lot in the operant conditioning, like what actually is operant conditioning, who was Edward Thorndike, what is law of effect, and who was the B.F. Skinner. We have learned all about this. If you still haven't watched that video, I've given the links in the description section. Still, if you're having any problem, you can ask me in the comment section, and I'll be happy to help you out. So in this video, the chapter of learning, this is going to be the lesson 2, types of learning. And in the types of learning, we are learning about operant conditioning. And in the operant conditioning, this is going to be the part 2D. So this is going to be lesson 2, part 2D, the concept of reinforcement. So if I give you a quick recap on the B.F. Skinner, what we have learned about the B.F. Skinner. So we've learned about B.F. Skinner, what is operant conditioning. We have learned about operant conditioning in the previous lectures, what is operant behavior, voluntary behavior. And we've also learned about the Skinner's box, but I will also share more about the Skinner's box with you in this video too. It will help you to understand this topic. And after that, in this video, we will learn about the concept of reinforcement, and in which we will learn about the primary and secondary reinforcers. And we will also learn about positive reinforcement, positive reinforcer, and negative reinforcer. And in the end, we will also learn about schedules of reinforcement. So let's start with the concept of reinforcement. Again, these are all topics which we will be learning in the concept of reinforcement. First of all, I would like to share the definition. I love to start lectures with a proper definition because it helps in understanding the topic easily. So if we start with the definition of reinforcement, the definition would include any event or stimulus that, when following a response, increases the probability that the response will occur again. Any event or stimulus, when it is followed by a response, it increases the probability of that response to occur again. And if we know what actually is reinforcer, because in reinforcement we study the reinforcers. So the definition of reinforcer is any event or object, or you can say any event or stimulus that, when following a response, increases the likelihood of that response occurring again. So let's start with the concept of reinforcement. We have learned the definitions. Now it's time to explain what actually it means. So what's in it for me? It represents the concept of reinforcement. which is one of Skinner's major contribution to behaviorism. So the word itself means to strengthen, and Skinner defined reinforcement as anything that following a response causes the response to be more likely to happen again. So typically this means that reinforcement is a consequence that is in some way pleasurable to the organism, which relates back to Thorndike's law of effect, the pleasurable consequence. Now, what's in it for the organism? The reward, so to speak. Now, going back to the Thorndike's puzzle box research, what was in it for the cat? Now, we can see that the escape from the box and the food that the cat received after getting out are both reinforcement. And they're both reinforcement of the liver pushing response. So every time the cat got out of the box, it got reinforced for doing so. Now, in Skinner's view, this reinforcement is the reason that the cat learned anything at all. In operant conditioning, reinforcement is the key to learning. Now, Skinner had his own version of a puzzle box called a Skinner box or operant conditioning chamber. Now, his early research often involved placing a rat into one of these chambers and training it to push down on a bar to get food. So, if I tell you about a typical Skinner box, so a typical Skinner box in which the rat is learning to press the bar in the wall of the cage in order to get food, which is delivered a few pallets at a time in the food. So in some cases, the light on the top left might be turned on to indicate that pressing the bar will lead to food, or to warn of an impending shock delivered by the gate on the floor of the cage. So this was the concept of reinforcement. Now it is time to learn about primary and secondary reinforcement. So the events or items that can be used to reinforce behavior are not all alike. So let's say that a friend of yours asks you to help her move some books from the trunk of her car to her apartment on the second floor, and she offers you a choice of $25 or a candy bar. So unless you have suffered a recent brain damage, you will most likely choose the money, right? So with $25, you could buy more than one candy bar. Now, pretend that your friend offers the same deal to a 3-year-old girl or a 3-year-old child who lives downstairs for carrying up some of the paperback books, $25 or a candy bar. Which reward will the child more likely choose? Now, most children at that age have no real idea of the value of money, so the child will probably use the candy bar. So the money in the candy bar represents two basic kinds of reinforcers: items or events that when following a response will strengthen it. So the reinforcing property of money must be learned, but the candy gives immediate reward in the form of taste and satisfying hunger. So a reinforcer such as a candy bar that satisfies a basic need like hunger is called a primary reinforcer. So let's learn about the definition of a primary reinforcer. Primary reinforcer is any reinforcer that is naturally reinforcing by meeting a basic biological need such as hunger, thirst, or touch. Now here examples would be any kind of reinforcers, like any kind of food, hunger drive, liquid thirst drive, or touch, which can be pleasure drive. So food is a hunger drive, liquid is a thirst drive, touch is a pleasure drive. So it can be any kind of reinforcer. Now, infants, toddlers, preschool age children, and even animals can be easily reinforced by using primary reinforcers. Whereas a secondary reinforcer, such as money, however, gets its reinforcing properties from being associated with primary reinforcers in the past. So a child who, let's start with the definition of the secondary reinforcer first. So any reinforcer that becomes reinforcing after being paired with a primary reinforcer, such as praise, token, or gold stars, are the secondary reinforcers. Now, a child who is given money to spend soon realizes that the ugly green paper can be traded for a candy and treats, which is a primary reinforcer. So money becomes a reinforcing in it and of itself. So if a person praises the puppy while patting him, so touch, which is a primary reinforcer, the praise alone will eventually make the puppy scream with delight. So the secondary reinforcers get their reinforcing power from the process of classical conditioning. And after all, the pleasure people feel when they eat, drink, or get a back rub is a reflex response. And any reflex response can be classically conditioned to occur to a new stimulus. Now, in the case of money, the candy is the unconditioned stimulus for pleasure, and the pleasure is the unconditioned response. And the money is presented, and the money is present just before the candy is obtained. So the money becomes a classical or conditioned stimulus for the pleasure, and people suddenly do feel pleasure when they have a lot of them, don't they? Now, in case of puppy, the petting is the unconditioned stimulus, and the pleasure at being touched and petted, the unconditioned response. So the praise, or more specifically the tone of voice, becomes the classical or conditioned stimulus for pleasure. Although classical and operant conditioning often work together, as in the creation of the secondary reinforcers, they are two different processes. So we have learned about the primary and secondary reinforcers. Now in the next video, we will learn about positive and negative reinforcement. So if your concept is clear, you can like the video. If there was anything that was a bit confusing, you can ask us in the comment section. Plus, if you're new to this channel, you can subscribe to our channel, subscribe to Dear Knowledge, click on the bell icon so you will never ever miss any notification. And you can also share the link of this video, the link of our YouTube channel with your family members and friends, because sharing is caring.